The word hit Eudora Lockhart like a slap across the face, open-palmed and deliberate, the kind that was meant to leave a mark for everyone in the room to see. Liar. Sheriff Dale Grover said it loud enough that the half-dozen men seated around the long table at the Coldwater Saloon all turned to look at her. She felt every one of those gazes like a brand pressed to bare skin. Her fingers tightened around the leather satchel in her lap, the one that held every document, every deed, every piece of paper that proved her father had built the Lockhart Ranch with his own 2 hands and left it to her, his only living heir. "I am not a liar," Eudora said, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out, even as her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Your daddy's been in the ground 3 weeks," Grover said, leaning back in his chair like a man who already knew how this conversation was going to end. "And you walk in here claiming you own 40,000 acres of the best grazing land in Colden County. A woman. Alone." He laughed, and the men around him laughed too, that particular kind of laugh that has no humor in it, only contempt. "The will is notarized," Eudora said. "The deed is recorded with the county. My name is Eudora Lockhart, and that land belongs to me." "Your name," Grover said, rolling the words around in his mouth like something sour, "don't mean a single thing in this county, sweetheart. You got no husband. You got no brother. You got no man to stand for you. Far as any court in the territory of New Mexico is concerned, you're just a woman making noise." The room fell into a hard, flat silence. Eudora felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, trying to bend her forward. She had been preparing herself for resistance, for delays, for the grinding bureaucratic indifference that women in 1883 were expected to accept with a smile. She had not prepared herself for the naked contempt in Grover's voice, for the way the other men were already looking past her, as though she were furniture that would soon be moved out of the way. She opened her mouth to speak again, and that was when it happened. The chair scraping back across the wooden floor was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that announced itself and made no apologies. Every head in the room turned. Eudora turned too. Lewis Keller rose slowly from his chair at the far end of the room. He had been sitting in the corner when she walked in, half in shadow, a cup of coffee on the table in front of him, and she had not paid him any particular attention. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone as the canyon walls outside of town. He wore a plain work shirt, no lawman's badge, no gunfighter's elaborate rig, just a working man's Colt on his hip, and the kind of quiet in his eyes that comes from a man who has learned to take the measure of things before he speaks. He rose slowly, and the room watched him rise, and when he was fully standing, he reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and produced a folded piece of paper. "I know that deed," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the way thunder carries, felt in the chest before it is heard with the ears. "I helped Arthur Lockhart file the original survey with the county recorder in 1871. I was 17 years old. I witnessed the signature. And I can tell you, Sheriff, that every word his daughter just said is the complete and exact truth." Grover's face shifted. "Keller, this doesn't concern you." "You just called a woman a liar in front of witnesses," Lewis Keller said, and there was something in his tone that was not anger exactly, but was the thing that lives just underneath anger, banked and controlled and 10 times more dangerous for being so. "In my experience, that concerns everyone in the room." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And Eudora Lockhart, who had walked into that saloon absolutely alone in the world, fighting for her name against men who had decided it did not matter, felt something crack open inside her chest that she had been keeping sealed shut since the day they put her father in the ground. Nobody had fought for her name until the rancher rose slowly in the middle of the room, and she would never forget it for the rest of her life. 3 weeks earlier, the land had been alive with the smell of her father's coffee. Eudora had grown up on the Lockhart Ranch knowing that smell as well as she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. Arthur Lockhart brewed his coffee at 4 in the morning, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the scent of it drifted through the whole house and woke her the way a church bell woke a congregation, with the understanding that the day was beginning and it was time to be useful. She was 26 years old in the autumn of 1883, and she had spent all 26 of those years learning the land her father loved. She could read the sky for rain. She could mend a fence line in the dark. She knew which pastures grew local weed and which wells ran sweet, and which sections of the South Canyon were prone to flash flooding in July. She had ridden every acre of those 40,000 acres with Arthur Lockhart riding beside her, and he had told her, more times than she could count, that this land was hers as much as it was his. "You are a Lockhart," he used to say, squinting out at the mesa in the late afternoon light when it turned the color of hammered copper. Lockharts don't give up their ground. He had died of a fever on the 14th of September, a fast and terrible fever that had come on in the night and taken him before the doctor could ride out from Coldwater. Eudora had held his hand and talked to him even when he could no longer answer, telling him about the cattle count and the condition of the north fence and the way the aspens up in the canyon were just starting to turn. She thought it was what he would have wanted to hear. She hoped it was. Then he was gone, and the silence on the ranch was a different kind of silence entirely. It was the silence of a world that had shifted underneath her feet and had not yet decided where it was going to land. She had the will. She had the deed. She had 12 years of ranch ledgers written in her own hand and her father's hand intertwined, evidence of a working partnership that any reasonable person could see at a glance. She had old Hector Ruiz, who had worked the Lockhart Ranch for 20 years and would work it 20 more if she asked him to. And she had Hector's wife Consuela, who had taught Eudora to make tamales and to set a broken bone, in that order. What she did not have was a husband, and in Colden County, New Mexico Territory, in the year of our Lord 1883, that absence was treated as a fatal wound. The trouble had started almost before the dirt was settled on her father's grave. Aldous Crane, who owned the neighboring Crane Cattle Company and had been trying to buy the Lockhart South pasture for 6 years, appeared at her door 3 days after the funeral with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that was arranged to appear sympathetic, but was actually something much closer to appetite. "Miss Lockhart," he had said, standing on the porch in his expensive coat, "I want you to know that I consider it my neighborly duty to make you a generous offer for this property. Running a spread this size alone, without a man to manage it, is going to be more than any woman can handle. You'd be doing yourself a kindness, selling now while the price is fair." Eudora had looked at him for a long moment. Aldous Crane was 52 years old, heavyset, with small pale eyes and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone he needed to fear. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Crane," she had said. "The answer is no." He had come back twice more in the following 2 weeks, each time with a slightly different arrangement of the same basic argument, and each time she had told him no with decreasing levels of politeness. After the third visit, she had begun to notice other things. The water rights document that should have been in her father's files had gone missing. A fence line on the eastern boundary had been cut, and 3 of her best bulls had wandered onto Crane land and had not been returned. Hector had found 2 men riding the north pasture who claimed they were Crane employees, and had been told that land was already sold. It was that last incident that had sent her to Coldwater to speak to Sheriff Grover, and it was there, in the Coldwater saloon, where Grover liked to conduct his unofficial business, that she had walked into a trap she had not fully understood, until the word liar was spoken aloud in a room full of men who were perfectly willing to believe it. The drive from the ranch to Coldwater took 3 hours on horseback, and Eudora had made it alone, which was either brave or foolish depending on who you asked. She had arrived with her documents in order and her chin level and her jaw set in a way that anyone who had known Arthur Lockhart would have recognized immediately as his expression on his daughter's face. She had not expected Lewis Keller. After he spoke, the room had gone through a complicated series of emotional weather patterns. Grover had blustered. Two of the other men had looked uncomfortable in the way that men look uncomfortable when they realize they have been caught participating in something that is going to look considerably worse in daylight than it did in lamplight. Crane's man, a thick-necked fellow named Briggs who Eudora now understood had been planted in that room deliberately, had said nothing and looked at the table. Lewis had not sat back down. He had remained standing, that folded paper still in his hand, and he had looked at Grover with the patient, level attention of a man who was used to waiting. "The survey document," he said, "is registered with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. The copy I'm holding is the one Arthur Lockhart gave me for safekeeping 11 years ago, because he said, and I am quoting the man directly, that he didn't trust Dale Grover as far as he could throw him. Arthur was a perceptive man." Someone in the room made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Grover's face had gone a particular shade of red. "You're interfering with county business, Keller." "I'm a citizen of Colden County and a landowner in my own right," Lewis said, "and I am telling you that this woman's claim is legitimate and her documents are in order. Unless you plan to arrest her, which I would very much like to see you try to justify to the territorial marshal, I suggest you acknowledge that and let her go about her business." The territorial marshal. Eudora had watched something move through Grover's eyes at those words, a cold calculation, the kind that meant he was weighing the short-term satisfaction of throwing his weight around against the longer-term consequences of doing so in front of a witness who clearly had no intention of being quiet about it. The calculation took about 15 seconds. "Nobody's arresting anybody," Grover said, and his voice had lost a great deal of its authority, like a fire that had been banked down to coals. "Miss Lockhart, your claim is on record. You're free to go." She had gone. Lewis Keller had walked out behind her. On the street in front of the saloon, in the flat, bright light of a New Mexico October afternoon, she had stopped and turned to face him. He was even taller outside, where there was sky overhead, and he had a way of standing that made her think of the juniper trees up on the mesa, solid and undemonstrative and entirely unmovable by wind. "I don't know you," she said. "Lewis Keller," he said. "I run the Double K Ranch about 15 miles north of your property. You told them you witnessed my father's deed signature." "I did. I was 17, and my father had brought me to the county recorder's office for some business of his own. Arthur Lockhart was there filing his survey and he needed a second witness. My father did it and I stood right beside him." He paused. "I liked your father. He was a fair man, honest as the day is long." Eudora felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had been her constant companion for 3 weeks. "He was," she said. They stood in the silence of the street for a moment. A wagon rolled past. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something that was probably not worth barking at. "What Crane is doing," Lewis said carefully, "is not going to stop because Grover backed down today. You know that. I know that. You have good people working for you, people you trust." "Hector Ruiz. He's been with us since before I was born." Lewis nodded, as though he had filed that information away in some ordered place in his mind. "You need to get that water rights document back. Without it, Crane can tie up your access to the Rio Seco tributary for years in the territorial courts. Even if you win eventually, you won't have the cash to run the operation through a long legal fight." Eudora stared at him. "How do you know about the water rights document?" Something moved briefly across his face, the ghost of an expression she couldn't quite read. "Because your father talked to me about it 2 months before he died," he said. "He was worried. He told me Crane had been pushing harder than usual. He asked me if I thought he should move the document somewhere safer." He stopped. I told him his files were fine. I should have listened to what he was telling me between the words. The weight in that sentence was enormous. She could hear it, the genuine regret underneath the plain language, the way a man carries something he wishes he had done differently. "It isn't your fault," she said, and she was surprised to realize that she meant it. "No," he agreed, "but I can help fix it if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long time. She had been raised by a man who trusted carefully and slowly, who believed that a person's character was revealed not by what they said about themselves, but by what they did when no one was watching. She did not know Lewis Keller. She did not know his motives or his history or what he expected in return for this intervention, and her instincts told her that a woman in her position needed to be careful about accepting help from strangers, no matter how impressively they stood up in a room. At the same time, her instincts also told her something else, something harder to articulate but impossible to dismiss. "All right," she said at last. He nodded once, brisk and businesslike, and said, "I'll ride out to the Double K and gather some things. Can I call on you tomorrow?" "I'll be there," she said. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so natural it seemed to belong to him the way the hat did, and walked off down the street toward the livery stable. Eudora watched him go, and then she turned and walked to where her own horse was tied, and she rode the 3 hours home under a sky that was going orange and purple at the horizon, thinking about a man who had risen slowly in the middle of a room and spoken her name like it mattered. Lewis arrived at the Lockhart ranch the following morning at 7 o'clock, which Eudora noted was an hour that suggested he had been riding since before dawn. He came with a file of papers under his arm, and Hector Ruiz, who had apparently met Lewis before, and shook his hand with the uncomplicated warmth of genuine mutual respect, took his horse and gave him coffee. They sat at the big kitchen table, the one her father had built himself from pine and determination, and Lewis spread his papers out. He had the territorial land registration, a copy of the original survey, and 2 letters from her father that he had kept for 11 years. When Eudora saw her father's handwriting on those letters, she had to press her lips together and look at the window for a moment. When she looked back, Lewis was pretending to examine something in the survey document with great concentration, giving her the space to compose herself without the awkwardness of acknowledgement. It was such a small thing, and it was so thoughtful that she liked him for it in spite of herself. "The water rights document," Lewis said when she was ready, "is almost certainly in Crane's possession. He or Grover, or more likely both of them together, arranged for it to disappear from your father's files sometime in the week after Arthur died, when the ranch would have been at its most vulnerable. Can we prove that? Not easily. What we can do is demonstrate that the document existed, and that its provisions applied to the Lockhart ranch, through secondary evidence. These letters your father wrote to me mention the water rights agreement specifically." He indicated the older of the 2 letters. "There are also 3 other landowners along the Rio Seco, who were part of the same water-sharing agreement signed in 1875. I need to contact all of them and get their copies, and then we file a complaint with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe over Grover's head." "That takes time," Eudora said. "Crane is already grazing his cattle on my east pasture." "I know." Lewis looked at her steadily. "I'll put 2 of my men on that fence line today. Not to pick a fight, just to make it clear that the boundary is contested and that you have representation." "Why are you doing this?" Eudora asked. She had been holding the question back since yesterday, and now it came out with a directness that she hadn't entirely planned. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Consuela singing something in Spanish in the yard, and the distant lowing of cattle, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch waking up into its day. "Your father was kind to me when I was 17 years old and didn't know much," Lewis said. "My own father wasn't an easy man to grow up under. Arthur Lockhart showed me what a decent man looked like, and it mattered more than he probably knew. I owe him something. This is the only currency I have left to pay it in." Eudora was quiet for a moment. "And beyond that," she said, because she trusted her instincts, and her instincts said there was something else in the room that hadn't been named yet. He looked at her directly, and she saw something in his face that was carefully contained but present, the way fire is present in a banked hearth, not visible as flame but warming the air around it. "Beyond that," he said, "you're dealing with something profoundly unjust. A woman who built her life alongside her father, who knows this land and has worked it and loves it, is being robbed of her birthright because she doesn't have a husband to speak for her. That's wrong. I don't need a more complicated reason than that. She believed him. That was the thing that surprised her most. She believed him completely, not because he was persuasive, but because there was no performance in how he said it, no arrangement of words designed to produce a specific effect. He just said it, flat and honest, the way you say a thing you have simply thought about until it's settled into certainty. "All right," she said, for the second time in 2 days. "Let's get to work." Over the next 2 weeks, Lewis Keller became a regular presence at the Lockhart ranch, and Eudora's understanding of the situation she was in shifted and deepened with each new piece of information that came to light. Aldous Crane was not simply an opportunistic neighbor. He had been in conversation with a land speculation company out of Denver, Colorado, a company that was buying up range land across the territory, in anticipation of the railroad expansion that everyone knew was coming within the next 5 years. The Lockhart Ranch, with its water access and its proximity to the projected rail line, was worth 3 times what Crane had offered her. Maybe more. If he could force a distressed sale, or better yet manufacture a legal situation that made the deed contestable, he stood to make an enormous profit. And Grover was his man, had been for years. Eudora's father had known it and had worked around it, but he had underestimated how far Crane was willing to go once the old man's protection was removed. Lewis had a contact in Santa Fe, a territorial land officer named Benjamin Marsh who was, as Lewis put it, one of the honest ones, and through Marsh they began to build the formal complaint, the letters, the secondary witness statements from the other water rights holders. A deposition from Hector Ruiz about the circumstances of the missing document. A sworn statement from the county recorder's deputy, a young woman named Clara Abel, who had quietly told Lewis that Grover had taken the Lockhart water rights document from the public files the week after Arthur's death, and that she had been too frightened to say so, until she had someone official to say it to. The work was grinding and meticulous, and required a kind of patient persistence that Eudora had in abundance but that she had not expected to find in anyone else. Lewis sat at her kitchen table for hours at a time, reading documents, writing letters in his clear, careful hand, arguing through legal strategies with the same thorough attention he presumably gave to fence lines and cattle counts and the other concrete problems of a working ranch. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches or gestures. He showed up at 7 in the morning and stayed until the work was done and then rode home in the dark, and he came back the next day and did it again. There was something in this consistency that Eudora found more affecting than any grand declaration could have been, because she was her father's daughter and her father had always said that a person's character was in their daily habits, in the small choices made when no one was keeping score. She also began to notice other things about him. The way he listened completely, without the half-distracted quality that most people brought to conversations because they were already forming their response. The way he treated Hector with the respect of one working man for another, without condescension and without performance. The way he sometimes paused in the middle of a document to look out the window at the land, and there was something in his expression during those moments that she recognized, because she had seen it on her own face in the mirror, a specific kind of love for wide open spaces that could not be faked and did not need to be explained. She began to find reasons to make the coffee last longer. She began to notice when he was amused by something, because it showed only in his eyes, a faint brightening, and she found herself saying things she thought might produce that effect. She began to understand that she was in some kind of trouble that had nothing to do with Aldous Crane. "You should know," Lewis said one afternoon about 2 weeks into their collaboration as they were riding the fence line of the east pasture, "that Crane is likely to escalate." "How?" "He's not going to win this legally, not once Marsh gets involved. He's probably starting to realize that. When men like Crane realize they can't win by rules, they change the game. Eudora looked at the fence line. Two of Lewis's men, Tom and a quiet Navajo cowboy named Dell, were riding along the other side of it, visible in the middle distance. Their presence had kept Crane's cattle off her east pasture for 10 days, but she knew Lewis was right that it was a temporary deterrence. "What does escalating look like?" she asked. "Could be anything. An attempt to discredit you personally, an accident on the property, pressure on your workers." He paused. "Or he could try a different angle entirely and approach some young man in the county with money and the suggestion that marrying you and your land would solve everyone's problems neatly." Eudora laughed before she could stop herself, a short, sharp sound that scattered two magpies from the fence post ahead of them. "He's going to try to find me a husband." Lewis's mouth curved at the corner, that small private amusement she had learned to watch for. It would be the most legal and efficient solution from his perspective. If you married someone he controlled, the land problem resolves itself. "That is such a deeply awful thing to think about," Eudora said. "It is," he agreed. "But it's the way some men think about women and property, and Crane is very much that kind of man." They rode in silence for a moment. The late October sky was the deep blue of polished turquoise overhead and paler at the horizon, and the grass in the pasture was tawny with the season, and the cottonwoods along the fence line had gone entirely yellow and were losing their leaves in a slow gold rain. "I was engaged once," Eudora said. She was not sure why she said it. It had simply risen to the surface like something that had been drifting up through dark water for a long time. Lewis waited. His name was Thomas Hale. He was the son of the banker in Coldwater, very presentable. My father was fond of him. We were engaged for 8 months. She stopped. He came to me 2 months before the wedding and told me that he had been informed by some of the men in town that a woman who spent as much time working cattle as I did was not going to make a proper wife. That I was too independent and too much like a man, and that he agreed with them. A silence stretched between them, long and considered. "He was a fool," Lewis said. "He was afraid," Eudora said. "Which I think is worse." Lewis looked at her and she looked back, and there was something in the exchange that felt like a door opening, though neither of them stepped through it. "For what it's worth," he said, "the men who told him that were fools and cowards both." "It's worth something," she said. And then, because she was not the kind of woman who let a moment of vulnerability extend past its natural length, she turned her horse toward the next section of fence and said, "Come on. I want to check the south gate before it gets dark." The crisis came in November, which was not a surprise. What was a surprise was the form it took. Lewis had warned her about escalation, but neither of them had anticipated that Crane's escalation would take the form of a lawsuit filed in the Colden County Court, claiming that the original Lockhart deed was fraudulently obtained because Arthur Lockhart had registered his survey on land that overlapped with a prior claim from a Mexican land grant dating back to the Spanish colonial period. It was, Lewis explained to her very carefully, and with the controlled intensity of a man who is very angry and is keeping that anger on a very short leash, a completely fabricated claim. "The Mexican land grants were adjudicated in 1872, he said. "This county has no unresolved grant claims." Crane had someone manufacture a document. "Can we prove it?" "It's what Marsh is already working on." Lewis pressed his hands flat on the table and breathed deliberately. "What this does in the short term is give Crane legal grounds to request a temporary injunction preventing you from operating the ranch during the dispute. It's designed to make you financially desperate." "How long would that take?" "A month to get the injunction hearing. 3 to 6 months to resolve the underlying claim if it goes through the territorial court." Eudora sat with that. The ranch could not run without operating capital. The cattle needed to be sold by spring. If she couldn't move cattle, couldn't pay Hector and his workers, couldn't maintain the property through the winter, the financial damage alone could force the sale that Crane hadn't been able to force legally. "He's patient," she said. "He's been doing this for a long time," Lewis agreed. He's bought out 5 smaller ranches in this county in the last 10 years. This is just the first time he's run into real resistance." Eudora looked at the table, at all the papers spread between them, at the 2 cups of cooling coffee, at Lewis's hands still flat on the wood. She thought about her father's voice saying that Lockharts don't give up their ground, and she thought about what it cost to hold ground, the actual price of it, in sleepless nights and legal fees, and the grinding weight of fighting on every single front at once. "What do we do?" she asked. Lewis was quiet for a moment that was a breath longer than his usual pause. When he spoke, his voice was careful in a way that she had come to recognize meant he was navigating something delicate. "There is a faster path," he said. "One that would make the entire manufactured claim collapse overnight, because it would make the question of who controls the Lockhart ranch completely unambiguous under territorial law." She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "Lewis," she said. He looked up. "Are you about to propose to me?" The silence in the kitchen was the most alive silence she had ever experienced. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing at the shutters, and somewhere in the barn a horse moved, and those sounds seemed to come from very far away. "I was working up to it," he said, "but you're faster than me." She should have laughed. She almost laughed. But what she actually did was sit back in her chair and look at him, really look, in the way she had been carefully not doing for the better part of 6 weeks, and what she saw was a man who was looking back at her with something in his face that had been there for a long time and had been just as carefully not spoken. "That is," she said slowly, "possibly the least romantic context in which a man has ever proposed to a woman." "I know that," he said. "And I want to be completely clear that I am not offering this as a transaction. I'm not trying to take your land from you or manage your affairs for you or become the man who stands between you and your own decisions." He stopped. "But I also want to be equally clear that it is not only strategy. It hasn't been only strategy for me for a while." She thought about the way he listened, about the letters he had kept for 11 years, about him rising in that room and speaking her name with the simple, unassailable authority of a man who believed it mattered. "I have known you for 6 weeks," she said. "You have," he agreed. "That's a very short time." "It is. My father used to say that you can know a person for 30 years and not know them, and you can know a person for 30 days and know them completely. He said it depends on the quality of the attention you bring." Lewis said nothing, but his eyes were steady on hers. "I would need it to be a real marriage," she said. "Not an arrangement, not a convenience. I won't enter into a lie." "I wouldn't want to lie either," he said. She looked at him for a long time in the bright November light coming through the kitchen window, the winter light that was low and clean and made everything look exactly as it was, without shadow or embellishment. "Ask me properly," she said. "Not as strategy. Ask me as yourself." He stood up. He came around the table and he stood in front of her, and he was not a man who went to his knee easily or performed sentiment he didn't feel. She had understood that about him from the first week, so when he did go to one knee on the kitchen floor, on the pine boards her father had laid himself, it meant everything. "Eudora," he said, "I have admired you from the moment you stood up in that room and refused to be made small. I have watched you work and think and love this land. And I have not been able to stop thinking about the fact that you deserve someone standing beside you who sees exactly what you are. I cannot promise you a smooth road or an easy life because I know what this country is and I know what the fight ahead looks like. But I can promise you that I will never call your name anything but what it is, and I am asking you sincerely to marry me." The wind pressed at the shutters. The fire crackled in the stove. "Yes," she said. "Yes, get up off that floor." He stood and she stood, and they were very close, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the angle of it that was exactly like the sandstone she'd thought of the first day she'd seen him, and felt him exhale in a way that suggested he had been holding that breath for considerably longer than one conversation. When he kissed her, it was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it carefully, and had decided that when he did it he was going to mean it. And Eudora, who had been kissed by exactly one man in her life, and had found the experience disappointing, discovered that the difference between a kiss from a man who is afraid of you and a kiss from a man who is not afraid of anything about you is enormous. It is, in fact, essentially the difference between being seen and being invisible. They were married in December of 1883 in the Coldwater Church, which was a small adobe building that smelled of beeswax candles and old wood, with Hector Ruiz and Consuela as witnesses and the minister, Reverend Abbott, who had known both their fathers and wept openly through the vows in a way that everyone pretended not to notice. The legal consequences of the marriage were swift and comprehensive. Lewis's attorney in Santa Fe, working in concert with Marsh at the Territorial Land Office, had the manufactured land grant claim dismissed within 3 weeks of the wedding. The combined Lockhart-Keller holdings, which now encompassed the Lockhart Ranch and the Double K, represented one of the largest private land claims in Colden County, and the territorial marshal, once properly briefed by Marsh, opened a formal investigation into Crane and Grover's activities. It took 6 months, but the investigation produced results. Sheriff Grover was removed from office in March of 1884. Aldous Crane was indicted on charges of fraud and document falsification in April. Clara Abel, the deputy recorder who had finally found the courage to testify, was offered a position with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, which she accepted with what Eudora was told was considerable relief and a great deal of visible emotion. But all of that was the framework, the structure that held the rest of it up. The thing that was actually happening in the interior of those months was something else entirely. Living alongside Lewis Keller was a revelation. She had expected the practical dimensions of it, the merged households, the combined operations, the early morning conversations over the cattle books that were now twice as thick. What she had not expected was the quiet texture of daily life with someone who was constitutionally incapable of pretense. He said what he meant. He thought before he spoke, which meant when he spoke it was worth listening to. He had a temper, she discovered in late January when a spring flood damaged the north fence and 3 days of repair work were undone overnight by a second storm. But his temper was directional, aimed at problems, not at people, and it burned hot and then was gone, leaving him clear-eyed and practical and ready to try again. He was also funnier than she had initially understood. Not joke-telling funny, not the performed humor of a man who wants to be liked, but quietly, unexpectedly funny in the way that people are who see the world with a slight tilt of irony and cannot always keep it to themselves. She found herself laughing more than she had laughed in years, at the observations he made about cattle and weather and neighbors and human nature, delivered in that unhurried voice with that faint brightening behind his eyes. And he loved the land. Not in the proprietorial way that Crane loved it, as a ledger entry, an asset to be maximized. He loved it the way Eudora loved it, the way her father had loved it, as a living thing that you entered into relationship with rather than simply owned. He knew the names of the washes and the mesas in both English and the Spanish that had been applied to them by the people who had worked this country before either of them was born. He knew where the pronghorn grazed in winter and where the golden eagles nested in the red rock above the canyon. In the evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch and watched the sky go through its extraordinary nightly theater, the colors that had no names in any language she knew, the stars coming out over the mesa in their thousands, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both were equally comfortable. She was in love with him. She had understood that she was falling in love with him during the kitchen table days of the legal fight, but she understood now, in the ordinary dailiness of living alongside him, that falling was the wrong word for what had happened to her. Falling implied a loss of control, a helplessness. What she felt was more like arriving, like she had been walking toward a specific place for a long time and had finally recognized it as the destination, One evening in February, when the first cold stars were out and the smell of wood smoke was on the air and she was sitting beside him in the porch's dusky warmth, she said, "I need you to know something." He turned his head and waited. "I am not someone who is easy to live with," she said. "I know that about myself. I have opinions about almost everything and I am not good at keeping them to myself, and I don't always ask for help when I should, and sometimes I make decisions about the ranch without consulting you because I have been making decisions about this ranch since I was 16 years old and it is deeply ingrained, and I don't intend to change any of those things." He was quiet for a moment. "I know all of that," he said. "You do, Eudora. I have known it since the second morning I sat at your kitchen table. I think you're testing me." She opened her mouth, closed it. "I might be," she admitted. "The answer is that I married you because of who you are, not who you might become if sufficiently managed." There was that eye brightening. "And for what it's worth, I have opinions about almost everything too. We are going to have some spectacular arguments over the next 40 years. She laughed, genuinely, the full-throat kind. "You think we'll last 40 years?" "I think," he said, his voice dropping into the quieter register that she had learned meant he was being most serious. "We will last a great deal longer than that." He reached across and took her hand in his, the way he had been doing since January when she'd stood beside him in the dark of the lambing shed working to save a ewe, and he'd simply taken her hand as they walked back to the house, and neither of them had mentioned it, but it had never stopped. His hand was warm and roughened by work, and entirely certain. She turned her hand over and held on. Spring came to the Lockhart ranch in a rush and a blaze of color, the way it always did in the high desert country of New Mexico, sudden and extravagant, and over almost before you could hold it. The chamisa bloomed bright yellow. The meadows above the canyon went green for their brief season. Calves appeared in the pastures, uncertain and alarmed by the world, and the work of the season was enormous and consuming and joyful in the specific way that hard work in a place you love is always joyful. Lewis hired 2 more hands for the spring gather, both men he had known from the Double K, and they integrated smoothly with Hector's crew, partly because Hector was a fair and straightforward man to work under, and partly because Lewis made it unambiguous that the ranch's operation was Eudora's domain as much as his own. He said it simply and without ceremony when he introduced the new men, watching their faces for the flicker of resistance that would tell him whether they were going to be a problem, and when he saw none, he moved on. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing at all. The formal charges against Crane went to the territorial court in May, and both Eudora and Lewis gave depositions. Eudora sat in the formal room in the Coldwater courthouse, which had been built the previous year and smelled of new lumber and legal ambition, and answered questions about the missing document and the fence line violations and the manufactured land grant claim with the steady, specific precision of a woman who had been keeping good records her entire life. Crane's attorney tried twice to suggest that she was confused about dates, and both times she produced the relevant ledger entry and referenced it with the page number and date written in her own hand, and the attorney looked increasingly unwell, and Crane looked at her across the room with his small, pale eyes and the particular expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he had genuinely believed was beneath his concern. She smiled at him. She could not help it. Outside the courthouse afterward, Lewis was waiting for her on the steps. He had testified earlier in the day, and she had not been able to be in the room for his testimony, but from the set of his shoulders and the quality of the light in his face she could tell it had gone well. "How was it?" he asked. "I believe the phrase is that they nailed him to the wall," she said. "Good." He held out his arm and she took it, and they walked down the courthouse steps into the May sunshine, and it occurred to her that this was what her father had meant when he talked about a partner. Not someone who completes you because you are incomplete, but someone who walks beside you through the actual texture of your actual life and is glad to be there. The Crane trial concluded in July. Aldous Crane was found guilty of fraud and document falsification and ordered to pay substantial penalties to the Territorial Land Office and to the parties whose records had been interfered with, which included Eudora. The Denver Land Speculation Company, once the legal proceedings became public, quietly withdrew from the county and moved its attention to other areas, which was not justice exactly, but was a form of retreat. The summer of 1884 was the best summer Eudora Lockhart Keller could remember. Not because nothing went wrong, because things went wrong constantly on a working ranch, floods and drought and sick cattle, and a wildfire in August that they fought for 3 days and contained only because Lewis had thought to create fire breaks along the mesa's edge the previous spring. But because she was living the life she had been built for, in the place she was built for, alongside the person she had somehow, improbably, found in the wreckage of the worst period of her life. In September, on the anniversary of her father's death, she went alone to the place on the South Mesa where you could see the whole sweep of the ranch below, the creek winding silver through the green bottom land, the main house and the barns, the cattle grazing in their distant quiet clusters, the red canyon walls on the western boundary going amber in the late light. She stood there a long time. She told her father about Lewis, about the marriage, about the fight they had won, about Crane's conviction. She told him that Hector was doing well, and that Consuela had planted a kitchen garden that was producing more tomatoes than any of them could eat. She told him the aspens in the canyon were turning again, the same deep gold as last year, that the world was still exactly the land he had made it. She heard footsteps behind her and did not have to turn around. Lewis stood beside her and looked out at the same view. "I thought I'd find you here," he said. "I come every year," she said. He nodded, and they stood together in the quiet of the mesa in the September light. And after a while he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and neither of them said anything more, because there wasn't anything more that needed saying. In October, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, which was where the important things always seemed to happen between them, at the table in the early morning over coffee, the ordinary sacred space of their daily life. She watched his face move through a complex series of expressions she had never seen on it before, or perhaps had seen in fragments and never assembled into this particular sequence. Surprise, and then a slow arriving joy, and then something that looked like reverence but might have been the face a man makes when the world becomes suddenly more than he thought it was. He came to her and held her very carefully as though she were something that had to be held gently, and she pressed her face against his neck and breathed in the smell of him, wood smoke and leather and the specific warmth of his skin, and thought that she was going to remember this moment for the rest of her life. "Are you frightened?" he asked, his voice quiet against her hair. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "A great deal. Are you happy?" She considered the question with genuine attention because that was the only way she knew how to answer questions, and she found that the answer was not complicated at all. "Yes," she said, "completely." Their son, Arthur Lewis Keller, arrived in May of 1885. During the same week the chamisa was blooming and the pastures were green, and the meadowlarks were doing their specific excellent best in the early mornings. He was healthy and loud and immediately opinionated, and he had his grandfather's eyes, which was the first thing Eudora thought when she looked at him, and which made her cry for the second time in the whole birth, the first time having been purely physical, and the second being of an entirely different category. Lewis held him with the careful attention of a man who has never held anything so important and knows it, and the expression on his face was the same one she had seen in the kitchen in October, that reverence, that overwhelming awareness that the world has expanded past its previous borders. "Arthur," Lewis said, testing the name. "He has your jaw," Eudora said. "He has your eyes," Lewis said. "He has Papa's eyes," she corrected, and Lewis looked at the baby and then at her and said quietly, "Yes." "He does," and pressed his mouth to her forehead. Consuela, who had been present for the birth along with the doctor from Coldwater, emerged from the bedroom with the pragmatic glow of a woman who has presided over the beginning of something good and knows it. Hector, who had been waiting in the kitchen since 4 in the morning, shook Lewis's hand and said bienvenido to the baby, and the baby blinked at him with the unseeing gravity of all very new people. The ranch grew. The Double K merged formally with the Lockhart in the land records over the following years, becoming what everyone in the county came to call simply the Keller-Lockhart operation, though Eudora was known to correct anyone who reversed the names to Lockhart-Keller, which was the order her father had built it in, and the order she intended it to stay. Lewis found this funny. He told her so, specifically and frequently, and she told him to mind his cattle, and he told her she had already given him more than his fair share, and they were both right. Arthur grew into a child who was, by general consensus, the most self-possessed small person anyone in Colden County had encountered. He walked early and talked early and asked questions about everything with a relentlessness that Consuela called a gift and Hector called an interesting challenge. He loved the horses with a passion that required careful supervision, and he loved being in the barn when calves were being born, and he loved sitting between his parents on the porch at night watching the stars, the three of them in the old porch chairs under the vast New Mexico sky. In the spring of 1887, when Arthur was nearly 2 years old, a young woman arrived in Coldwater on the stage from Santa Fe. Her name was Marisol Ruiz, and she was Hector's niece, come to take up a position as schoolteacher at the newly established Coldwater School. She was 22 years old and had been educated at the Sisters of Loretto Academy in Santa Fe and had, Hector told Eudora with considerable pride, the finest mathematical mind the sisters had encountered in 20 years of teaching. Eudora liked her immediately. Lewis liked her immediately. Arthur liked her best of all and followed her around the yard on the occasions she came to Sunday dinner with Hector and Consuela, chattering at her about horses and stars and the color of the canyon in the afternoon. Marisol opened the Coldwater School in September of 1887 with 11 students, and within a year had 23, drawn from across the county, by a combination of her genuine gifts as a teacher and the spreading understanding among ranch families that their children's futures would be shaped by what they learned in rooms like hers. Eudora supported the school formally and practically, donating lumber for the expansion and organizing the school committee and writing 2 letters to the territorial superintendent of education that resulted in a budget increase and a 3rd new school reader. It was work that mattered to her not because it was strategic or because it built anything she could put her name on, but because it was the kind of work her father would have done, the kind that served the place you lived in, that paid back what the place had given you. Lewis, watching her manage the school committee meeting one October evening in 1888, in the new school building that smelled of pine shavings and chalk, with the lamplight warm on the faces of the ranchers and farmers and their wives gathered around the tables, thought about the Coldwater Saloon on an October afternoon 5 years ago, and the woman who had stood in that room and refused to be made small, and the man he had been then, sitting in a corner with a cup of coffee, waiting for something he hadn't known he was waiting for. He thought about what it meant to rise in the middle of a room. Not the physical act, but the thing behind it, the choice to insert yourself into a moment of injustice when it would be easier to remain seated. He had done it partly for Arthur Lockhart's memory, and partly because the sight of a woman being called a liar for telling the truth was more than he could absorb without response. But partly, he understood now, because something in him had recognized her from across the room in a way he couldn't have explained and still could not entirely explain. He had been right about the 40 years. He was increasingly confident on that point. Their daughter, Clarita Elena Keller, arrived in March of 1889, named partly for Clara Abel, who had found her courage in a county recorder's office and helped change the course of several lives, and partly for Consuela, whose full name was Consuela Elena. Consuela was in the room when the baby was born and held her before Lewis did, and when she gave her back she said simply, "She is the continuation," in Spanish, which Eudora understood completely and agreed with. Clarita was different from Arthur in every discernible way. Quieter, more observant, given to long silences in which something was clearly happening that she had not yet decided to share. She sat in the yard for entire half-hours watching the behavior of the ranch cats with a concentration that her parents found both admirable and slightly unnerving. She had Eudora's eyes and Lewis's jaw and her great-grandfather Arthur's deep and patient relationship with the land, which manifested at age 2.5 as an absolute refusal to come inside if there was still light in the sky. Lewis said she was exactly like her mother. Eudora said she was exactly like her father. Arthur, aged 4, said she was loud sometimes and he didn't understand what she wanted, which was the most honest assessment of any of them. By 1890, the ranch had grown to 55,000 acres, a product of land purchases made carefully and strategically over 6 years, and employed 20 full-time workers, including 3 families who lived in houses built on the property, and operated a small but consistent beef cattle business that supplied several markets in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. The railroad had come through the county in 1888, 2 years earlier than anyone had predicted, and the Keller Lockhart Ranch was positioned almost exactly as Lewis had understood it would be. Close enough to the new line to ship cattle economically, far enough from the construction corridor that the disruption had been minimal. They had not become rich from it, because becoming rich had never been the goal, but they had become stable in a way that weathered the drought of 1889 and the economic difficulty of 1890 without the kind of desperation that forced other operations to sell. Crane's former holdings had been sold in pieces at court auction in 1885, most of them bought by the smaller ranchers he had displaced or pressured over his years of expansion, which was a form of poetic justice that Eudora acknowledged and then deliberately moved past, because she had learned from her father that the energy you spend on satisfaction is energy not spent on the actual work in front of you. The Coldwater of 1890 was a different town than the Coldwater of 1883. It had a proper courthouse and a school with 2 teachers, Marisol Ruiz and a young man from Missouri named Collins who taught the older children. It had a doctor who lived there rather than riding out from the next county. It had a bank that was not, as far as anyone could determine, operating as an instrument of land speculation. The sheriff, a quiet man named Porter who had been elected in 1884, ran his office without visible corruption, which in the context of 1880's New Mexico Territory was a genuine achievement. Eudora was on the school committee and the water rights committee and the newly formed County Agricultural Association, and Lewis was on the Range Land Management Committee and served on the county commission in a non-elected advisory capacity. They did this work alongside the ranch work, which meant their days were long and their evenings short, and they had learned to have important conversations in the saddle and over the breakfast table, and in the 10 minutes between the children falling asleep and their own exhaustion claiming them. It was not a perfect life. Nothing is. There were seasons of drought and seasons of loss, and the particular grief of watching the older workers, Hector and Consuela especially, age in ways that were visible and could not be argued with. There were arguments between Lewis and Eudora that were spectacular in their thoroughness and their specificity, and that generally concluded with both of them being right about different aspects of the same problem, which was frustrating and also, somehow, deeply satisfying. There were hard winters and sick children, and the bureaucratic complexity of operating a large ranch in a territory that was still finding its relationship with its own laws. There were moments of genuine fear, the kind that comes in the night when a child's cough sounds wrong or a flash flood is running in the canyon, and you can't account for where everyone is. But there were also mornings when the light came over the mesa and turned the whole world gold, and the cattle were moving in the distance, and she could smell her husband's coffee from the kitchen, and her children's voices were audible somewhere in the yard, Arthur's clear and interrogative, Clarita's lower and contemplative, and the land was alive all around her in every direction for as far as she had ever been able to ride, the land her father had built and she had held and they were holding still. Lewis came out onto the porch one such morning in October of 1891, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and handed her one and stood beside her in the early light, and they looked out at the land together in the companionable silence that was one of the most specific gifts of the life they had made. "I was thinking about the south pasture," Eudora said. "The fence line along the creek," he said. "The same section your father and my father argued about in 1874. Lewis smiled. "They were both right and both wrong, which is probably why it keeps needing repair. I think we should move the fence line 20 feet west," she said. "I was going to suggest that last month," he said. "You should have said something. You would have suggested it first eventually." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the pasture with that expression she loved, the one that was entirely present, entirely attending to the actual world in front of him. "I would have," she admitted. "I know," he said. "That's what I was waiting for." She shook her head, and he caught her doing it, and the brightening was there in his eyes, that faint internal light that had never stopped being the thing she most looked forward to seeing in any given day. "Lewis," she said. "Eudora," he said. "I think I am happier than I knew how to be when I was younger." He turned to look at her fully, and the October light was on his face, and he was 38 years old in that light, with the years in the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples and the solidness of him that had not changed from the day he had risen in the middle of a room and spoken her name, and she thought that he was the most familiar and most continually surprising person she had ever known. "I think that's the best thing you've ever said," he said. "Don't tell me that." "I've said a great many excellent things." "You have," he agreed entirely seriously, "but that one is the best." She laughed, and he smiled, and the sun was coming up over the mesa, and the chamisa was holding its late yellow, and the cattle were moving in the pasture and their children were somewhere in the yard, and the coffee was warm in her hands and the land stretched out in every direction, alive and known, and entirely their own. Arthur and Clarita came around the corner of the house at that moment, engaged in some complex and apparently deeply felt disagreement about the identity of the hawk they had seen from the yard window, Arthur insisting it was a red-tailed hawk and Clarita insisting with the quiet certainty of a 7-year-old who has been watching hawks for her entire conscious life, that it was a Swainson's hawk, and they were clearly different. Lewis put his coffee down and crouched to their level. "Tell me what you saw," he said, and gave them both his complete attention, and they gave their evidence, and he considered it as though it were the most important ornithological question he had encountered, which in that moment, Eudora understood, it genuinely was. She watched him with their children and thought about the word that had been thrown at her in that saloon 8 years ago, the word meant to diminish her, to make her small, to strip the ground from beneath her feet. And she thought about how little it had ultimately mattered, not because the injustice was small, it was not small, but because she had not been alone in that room, and she had not been alone since, and the world was built in the end not by the men who tried to take what wasn't theirs, but by the people who stayed and worked and loved the places they belonged to. "Swainson's hawk," Lewis said, settling the argument with the confidence of a man who knows his birds. "Clarita is right." Arthur looked at his sister with the expression of a child who is recalibrating. "How do you know?" he said to her. "I watched it," she said simply. Lewis caught Eudora's eye over the children's heads, and the look they exchanged was brief and wordless, and contained everything. The years of work and laughter and argument, the legal battles and the sleepless nights, the porch and the mesa and the kitchen table where the important things always happened, the 2 small people between them who were evidence of a life built on something real. Hector appeared at the barn door and called that the morning work was ready, and Lewis stood and picked Clarita up and set her on his shoulders, her small hands in his hair, and Arthur ran ahead of them toward the barn, and Eudora finished her coffee and set the cup on the porch railing and followed her family into the morning. The mesa was red in the early light. The sky was enormous and very blue. Somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a meadowlark was doing its extravagant best. The land was hers, the land was theirs, and nobody, now or ever again, would have reason to question the name on it. Eudora Lockhart Keller walked into the morning, and the day opened around her like a country she already knew, every draw and canyon and pasture and fence line, every good acre of it, every difficult acre of it, every acre her father had ridden and she had ridden and her children would ride after her. And the world was big and bright and full of the specific, irreplaceable joy of a life that had been fought for and won and was being lived, right now, in the only moment that had ever really existed. In the October light of 1891, on the ranch that bore her name alongside his, Eudora Keller looked back once at the house where she had grown up and where she was growing old, and she thought of her father and she thought of the word liar thrown in a room, and she thought of a man rising slowly to his full height with something folded in his hand and something steady in his eyes, and she thought that the best stories are not the ones about the battles, though those matter, but the ones about what you build in the quiet afterward, about the kitchen table and the morning coffee, about the children arguing about hawks, about the hand taken in the dark of the lambing shed and never entirely released, about a man who had risen for her name when no one else would, and in doing so had given her far more than a name. He had given her the knowledge that she did not have to be alone in the room, that there was such a thing as a person who would stand up for the truth of you simply because you were true, and that this knowledge, once you had it, changed the shape of everything. She had the land. She had the name. She had the man who had risen for both of them, and who was now walking ahead of her with their daughter on his shoulders and the October light on his back, into the ordinary, extraordinary morning that was waiting for all of them. She walked to catch up. She always would.